She came back unannounced to surprise them for Christmas. Her mother cried silently on the balcony, staring at the tree lights. Inside, her husband laughed with his family, as if nothing was missing. No one noticed she'd returned, but she understood everything. At dawn, she changed the locks and turned off the lights. A very story of a powerful woman. Hi, my beautiful family, welcome back to Mr. Peter's Stories. May the Almighty pour His finest mercy upon every woman in this family, the women whose love heals, whose patience protects, and whose spirit cannot be broken. May He wrap you in a peace so deep it calms every storm, give you a strength so pure it lifts generations, and place a light inside you that no darkness can dim. You are the silent warriors, the gentle leaders, the unshakable backbone of every home. May your days be soft, your nights be safe, and your heart be forever treasured. And my family, I humbly ask, please lift Binta in your prayers. She is not well, and your prayers carry a power stronger than medicine. Pray for her healing, her comfort, and her strength. If your heart is true, like this video. If your love is real, comment, we're praying for Binta. Praying for some betrayals announce themselves with screaming and shattered glass, but the worst ones arrive wrapped in Christmas lights and laughter that doesn't belong to you anymore. Alicia Moss stood in the December darkness outside the house she built with her dead father's insurance money, her suitcase heavy with 3 months of Jamaica red dirt and documents that should have saved everything. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows she installed herself, she watched strangers drink wine from her wedding crystal, while her husband played host to a party she knew nothing about. The tree she'd decorated last year sparkled in the corner, but someone had removed the ornaments her mother made, the hand-painted angels and clay stars that carried memories of childhood Christmases when they had nothing but each other. In their place hung expensive glass baubles that caught the light like ice. Her eyes moved past the celebration to the balcony where her mother sat alone. Sophia Winfrey was slumped in the wheelchair Alicia bought after the stroke, wrapped in a thin summer blanket, despite the winter cold that turned breath to fog. Even from the sidewalk, Alicia could see her mother's shoulders shaking. Tears caught the glow from the party lights, running down Sophia's face in silent streams, while inside the house, blazed with warmth that didn't reach her, Alicia watched her mother sit there for 10 minutes. Not one person came to check. Not one face appeared in the doorway to ask if she needed anything. Then Richard's sister, Christine, stepped onto the balcony and Alicia's hands clenched around her suitcase handle. Christine didn't approach Sophia with concern or a warmer blanket. She stood near the railing, scrolling through her phone, laughing at something on the screen, the sound carrying across the cold air. She glanced at Sophia once with an expression that looked like disgust, then went back inside and let the glass door slam shut behind her. The vibration made Sophia flinch, but she didn't call out. She just pulled the inadequate blanket tighter and stared at the Christmas lights strung along the neighbor's roof inside. Richard's brother Derek posed by the tree taking selfies, champagne glass raised in a toast to his own reflection. His smile was wide and performative, the kind designed for people who follow strangers online and pretend pixels equal connection. Richard himself stood in the center of a circle of guests, animated and charming in the cashmere sweater Alicia bought him last Christmas. He was telling a story, his hands moving expressively, and the guests laughed on cue like he was conducting them. Alicia's feet carried her to the front door before her mind caught up with her body. She reached for her key, the one she'd carried through every shift at the hospital, every grocery run, every exhausted midnight return from caring for patients who reminded her why nursing mattered. The key slid into the lock and stopped. It didn't turn. She tried again, thinking maybe the cold had warped something, maybe she was tired and doing it wrong. Nothing. The key didn't fit anymore. She walked around to the side door, her heart starting to pound in a rhythm she didn't recognize. That lock rejected her key too. The back door with its view of the garden she'd planted did the same. Someone had changed every lock in the house she bought with her inheritance, the house her father died to give her, the house that held her name on the original deed before love made her add someone else's through the window. She heard Richard's voice rising above the party noise. "My wife chose money over family," he was saying to a woman in a red dress, who nodded sympathetically. "3 months she's been in Jamaica selling property while I held everything together here. I'm doing my best with her mother, but honestly, some people just can't handle commitment when it gets difficult. She wanted the cash more than she wanted us." The guests made understanding sounds. Someone touched Richard's arm in comfort. The woman in red said something about modern marriages lacking loyalty. Richard accepted their sympathy with the graceful sadness of someone who'd practiced the performance. Alicia looked at the mantel above the fireplace, where their wedding photo used to sit in the silver frame her nursing colleagues gifted them gone. In its place, an artistic black and white shot of Richard flanked by Christine and Derek, all three of them looking like they'd stepped out of a catalogue advertising beautiful people with empty souls. Her grandmother's quilt that usually draped over the couch was missing. The painting she'd bought from a local artist during their anniversary trip was replaced by something stark and modern that Richard probably claimed he created himself. She stood outside her own home looking through windows at a life that had erased her while she was gone, and something cold settled into her chest. Not the hot rage she expected, but something colder and harder. Clarity, maybe. Or the death of illusions that should have died years ago. She went back to her car and retrieved the garage code, but when she tried it, the system beeped rejection. Changed. Everything changed. She'd been gone for 3 months keeping promises, while they'd spent those months rewriting history to exclude her existence. Alicia walked around to the side gate, the one that led to the balcony. It still opened, with the combination lock she'd installed herself, the code her mother's birthday numbers. She moved quietly across the stone pathway she'd laid, past the rose bushes she'd planted, and climbed the steps to where Sophia sat, trembling in the cold. When her mother's eyes focused on her face, Sophia didn't smile with relief. She closed her eyes in something that looked like shame and whispered through her stroke-weakened speech. "I'm sorry I became such a burden you had to come back early." The words hit Alicia like a physical blow. She knelt beside the wheelchair, ignoring the cold stone against her knees, and took her mother's hands. They were ice. Her mother's clothes carried the sour smell of urine that had been there for hours. Her lips were cracked from dehydration. Her eyes held an emptiness Alicia recognized from patients who'd given up hope. "Mama," Alicia whispered, "I came back because I finished early. I came back to surprise everyone for Christmas. Why are you out here? Where's your warm blanket? When did you eat last?" Sophia's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Don't make me tell you. Please, baby, let's just go. I don't want to ruin their party." Their party, not our family's Christmas, not your homecoming celebration, their party. The words told Alicia everything she needed to know about what the last 3 months had actually been. She got her mother down the back stairs, through the gate, and into her car without anyone inside noticing. The party continued its performance of joy, while Alicia drove to the nearest hotel with Sophia crying silently in the passenger seat. She got her mother into a room, helped her into the shower, and watched 3 months of neglect wash down the drain. She ordered room service, and watched her mother eat soup like someone who'd forgotten what real food tasted like. She listened to fragments of truth that came between bites, being left in soiled clothes, eating scraps from their plates, sitting alone in the cold room Richard had moved her to because her presence depressed the house. When Sophia finally fell asleep in clean clothes on soft pillows, Alicia sat in the darkness and made phone calls. She called the lawyer who'd handled her house purchase. She called the locksmith who'd installed her original deadbolts. She called her supervisor at the hospital. She called people whose names Richard didn't know existed, building a foundation he'd never seen her lay, because he'd never paid attention to anything that didn't serve him. At dawn, She returned to the house alone. The locksmith met her there with documentation that proved she owned this property before marriage, that inheritance laws gave her rights Richard had assumed didn't exist. The lawyer stood on the sidewalk reviewing papers, while the locksmith changed every lock on every door and window. They worked methodically, while inside Richard and his siblings slept off their champagne excess, sprawled across furniture Alicia's salary had paid for in rooms her inheritance had built. Alicia taped a note to the front door. She didn't write an explanation or an accusation. She didn't waste words on people who'd never valued hers. She wrote, "The house remembers who paid for it. Your key no longer works because you no longer live here." Richard woke at mid-morning to the sound of his key failing in the lock. She heard him try it again and again, his movements becoming more aggressive. She heard him yell for Christine and Derek. She heard the confusion turn to panic, turn to rage. He pounded on the door hard enough to rattle the frame. "You can't do this! This is my house! Alicia, open this door right now!" Alicia stood on the other side, watching through the peephole as her husband transformed. His charm evaporated. His artistic sensitivity vanished. His careful mask of the misunderstood creative soul cracked apart. And underneath was just a man who'd never expected consequences, who'd built his life on the assumption that the woman who loved him would accept anything, because she'd already accepted everything. His fist hit the door again. "I know you're in there. We need to talk about this like adults. You can't just lock me out." She watched him through the tiny circle of glass, seeing him clearly for the first time, and she felt nothing but cold certainty that she'd wasted 8 years on a man who'd only loved what she could provide, never who she actually was. Richard's face was red with fury, veins standing out in his neck, spittle flying as he screamed threats about lawyers and property rights and how dare she humiliate him like this. Alicia turned away from the door and walked through her reclaimed house, touching surfaces that were hers again, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders with each step. Outside, Richard continued his performance of outrage for a neighborhood that was just waking up and starting to watch. She didn't open the door. She didn't respond to his threats. She simply walked into her kitchen, made coffee in the silence that finally felt like peace, and waited for him to understand that the woman he'd tried to break had just started building something he could never touch again. Chapter 2. The foundation that held Alicia sat on the hotel bathroom floor at 2 in the morning with her back against the cold tile, watching her mother sleep through the open door, while her hands trembled around the small digital recorder she'd found hidden in the wheelchair's side pocket. She pressed play, and Sophia's voice filled her ears through headphones, shaking but methodical. Day 2 after Alicia left. "Richard stopped helping me to the bathroom this morning." The words hit Alicia like a fist to the chest, but what hit harder was the memory that surfaced unbidden. Richard at that hospital charity auction 8 years ago, standing beside his paintings, looking lost and beautiful, telling her about 60,000 in debt from a failed gallery. She'd been 25, fresh off a double shift, wearing her nicest dress that still came from a clearance rack. She'd bought one of his paintings, not because she particularly liked it, but because he looked like he needed someone to believe in him. Her father had died the week before her 16th birthday, leaving behind insurance money her mother, Sophia, had protected like it was sacred. They'd lived on factory wages while Alicia worked grocery store shifts and studied in break rooms, earning a nursing scholarship through relentless determination. She'd been trained her whole life to save people who were suffering, and Richard had looked like he was suffering. She'd paid off his debt over 2 years. Every extra shift, every careful budget, every dollar she didn't spend on herself went to banks and credit card companies, while Richard painted in her apartment and promised his art would eventually sell for enough to pay her back, with interest. She'd never asked for repayment. Love wasn't supposed to be transactional. The recorder continued. "I called out twice. He walked past my room without stopping. I had an accident." Alicia's hands clenched around the device. At 28, she'd bought the house with her father's insurance money. 200,000 her mother had grown through careful investments. The deed carried only her name because she wasn't married yet. Richard proposed a month later on the back porch, saying, "You make me want to be the man I always thought I could be." She'd added him to the deed because partnership meant sharing everything, because marriage meant trust, because she'd never learned that love could be weaponized. She forwarded through the recording to the next day her mother's voice. Christine said it was disgusting. She said I should be in a home. The memory came sharp and unwanted. Richard's parents dying in that car accident during their first year of marriage, his siblings Christine and Derek shattered and grieving, nowhere stable to go. Alicia had opened her home temporarily, paid funeral expenses, helped Christine get work, helped Derek with college applications. Temporary had stretched into 2 years of them eating her food, using her utilities, contributing nothing while complaining the neighborhood wasn't trendy enough and the internet wasn't fast enough for gaming. Then Sophia's stroke, 18 months ago. Alicia had converted the downstairs guest room without hesitation, installed grab bars, hired a part-time aide. Richard had complained about the crowding, the medical equipment, how Sophia's speech difficulties were depressing to listen to during dinner. Alicia had made it work because that's what she did, made impossible things work through sheer force of will. She pressed play again. Week 3 of the recordings, Derek's voice in the background, mocking Sophia's stroke-affected speech while recording videos for his friends. Alicia stood up from the bathroom floor, her legs stiff from sitting, and walked to the hotel window overlooking the city. The memory of Richard's breakdown was so vivid she could still see his face, crying in her arms about his supposed business partner vanishing with 50,000, about facing bankruptcy again, about how he'd considered ending everything because what was the point when the universe kept crushing him? The only solution had been Sophia's childhood property in Jamaica. Developers wanted the land, and the house was worth approximately 400,000. Sophia had agreed immediately, understanding her daughter's marriage was drowning and only significant money could save it. "Please, baby," Richard had said at the airport, holding her hands, his eyes wet with tears. "Go to Jamaica and get us what we deserve. I'll take care of your mother, I promise. I'll prove I can be the man you need me to be." She'd believed him because she'd invested 8 years in believing him, because walking away meant admitting all that time and money and emotional labor had been wasted on someone who would never become what he promised to be. 3 months in Jamaica. Her grandmother's house with no electricity. Corrupt officials demanding bribes. Developers trying to intimidate her into lowball offers. She'd fought for every dollar, sleeping on bare floors, negotiating through exhaustion, securing 400,000 through persistence and refusal to be cheated out of her family's legacy. Every single night, she'd called home. Every single night, Richard had sent perfectly staged photos of Sophia smiling in her wheelchair, had told stories about their day together, had thanked Alicia for her sacrifice, and promised everything would be different when she returned. The photos had been lies. The stories had been lies. The promises had been lies. Alicia returned to the bathroom and picked up the recorder again, forwarding to week 6, Richard's voice, drunk and slurring. "Alicia's the kind of woman who thinks being useful makes her valuable. I've spent 8 years teaching her that she's boring, that her nursing stories are tedious, that the only interesting thing about her is what she can provide." She listened to her husband laugh about training her, about how she apologized for talking about her work now, about how she asked permission to spend her own money. She listened to him explain his divorce plan. Wait for the Jamaica money, file papers immediately, liquidate the house, split proceeds with his siblings, put Sophia in whatever Medicaid facility would take her. Derek's voice. "What if she fights back?" Richard's laugh. "With what? She gave me everything. Her inheritance bought this house. Her salary paid my debts. Her emotional labor held me together when I was falling apart. She's got nothing left to fight with. She spent it all on me." Alicia turned off the recorder and sat in the silence, watching her mother sleep peacefully for the first time in months, and understood something fundamental. She hadn't wasted 8 years on Richard. She'd invested 8 years in learning exactly how strong she was, how much she could survive, and what she refused to accept anymore. She picked up her phone and started making calls. The real estate attorney who'd handled her house purchase answered on the third ring. Despite the early hour, Patricia Okafor listened to selected recordings and spent an hour reviewing documents before explaining that Alicia had legal leverage most wives wouldn't have. The house purchased entirely with inheritance before marriage, state law recognizing inherited assets as separate property, elder abuse giving grounds for immediate removal. The case was winnable. Jamaica Reynolds caught a flight the moment Alicia called, bringing her entire advocacy organization's infrastructure. Dr. Teresa Harrison offered Alicia's old job back at higher pay and connected her with the hospital's legal aid program. These were the people whose names Richard didn't know existed, the foundation Alicia had built that he'd never seen because he'd never paid attention to anything that didn't serve him. Then, Alicia called Richard's estranged aunt Beatrice, the family member he'd cut off 5 years ago for causing drama. Beatrice arrived at the hotel within an hour. A 60-year-old woman with steel-grey hair and eyes that had witnessed too much suffering to believe in easy redemptions, she listened to selected recordings without visible reaction, hands folded in her lap, expression carefully neutral. When the recordings ended, Beatrice was quiet for several minutes. Then she began talking about Richard's father, Charles, who'd married 3 times and drained each wife financially and emotionally. Richard's mother, the second wife, had died working retail at 70, living in a studio apartment, apologizing to Beatrice for being a burden when she couldn't afford her medications. "I tried to warn you before the wedding," Beatrice said quietly. "I showed up at your engagement party with documentation of the family pattern. Richard cut me off completely, made you choose between him and me. You chose him because that's what women do when the man they love presents the choice as proof of loyalty." She'd been keeping records for 20 years, newspaper clippings about Charles's bankruptcies, court records from divorces, interviews with his ex-wives describing identical tactics. She knew about Derek's fraud charges in Arizona that he'd fled. She knew about Christine's embezzlement from her last employer. She knew Richard's business partner who disappeared was actually his college friend, staging fraud. "I've been waiting for someone to listen," Beatrice said, her voice steady. "I watched my brother destroy 3 women. I watched Richard learn every tactic from his father. I kept these records because I knew eventually the pattern would repeat badly enough that someone would pay attention. I just hoped it wouldn't be too late." By dawn, Alicia sat at a table with Patricia, Jamaica, Dr. Harrison and Beatrice, surrounded by documents and recordings and decades of family history. They built a strategy with military precision, legal steps, safety protocols, timeline for actions that would dismantle Richard's life with the same thoroughness he'd planned to dismantle hers. Alicia looked at these women who'd survived their own battles and learned to fight, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, but something harder: determination, clarity, the cold certainty that she was done being the woman Richard had trained her to be. "They wanted me broken," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 3 months in Jamaica and 8 years of slowly disappearing. "They bet everything on me staying broken. They're about to learn what happens when broken things refuse to stay shattered." Beatrice reached across the table and took Alicia's hand. "You're my sister-in-law's daughter in every way that matters. She would be so proud of you right now, not for what you're about to do to them, but for what you're about to do for yourself." Outside the hotel window, dawn was breaking over the city. Alicia watched light spread across buildings and streets, erasing darkness inch by inch, and understood that sometimes you have to burn down everything you built on lies before you can start building on truth. Chapter 3. The Recordings That Spoke. The recorder was cheap plastic and outdated technology, the kind that should have been obsolete, but somehow survived in her mother's hands like a weapon nobody saw coming. Alicia plugged in headphones and let the truth pour into her ears in Sophia's voice, steady and methodical, despite the stroke's lingering effect on her speech. Her mother had been documenting everything, creating an evidence trail that would hold up in any court or conversation or moment. When Richard tried to rewrite reality with his charm and artistic sensitivity and carefully constructed victim narrative, the first week's recordings were almost bearable. Richard's neglect was passive, a matter of ignoring Sophia's needs rather than actively causing harm. He didn't help her to the bathroom when she called. He didn't check if she'd eaten. He didn't make sure she had her medications on schedule. The part-time aide came when scheduled, and during those hours, Sophia received the care Alicia had arranged. The rest of the time, she was alone in her room with a bell. Nobody answered, and a wheelchair. She couldn't navigate herself through a house that hadn't been designed for her limitations. Christine's voice cut through the background of one recording. "I don't understand why we're responsible for this. She's not our mother. This is Richard's wife's problem, not ours. We shouldn't have to live like this." Derek's response was casual, unbothered. "Just wait until the Jamaica money comes through. Then we can figure out permanent care. Richard said there are state facilities that take Medicaid. It's not like she needs anything fancy. She just sits there anyway." Richard's voice, calm and cold. "Let's not talk about this where she might hear she's already depressing enough without making her paranoid too." By the second week, the recording showed calculation replacing neglect. Sophia described being given cold soup from a can while she watched them eat takeout Chinese food at the dining table. She described Christine laughing about the vegetable in the wheelchair with someone on the phone. She described Derek positioning his phone to record videos of her struggling to speak clearly, mocking her stroke-affected words for entertainment. He shared with friends who found disability hilarious. The third week brought recordings of Richard's voice, explaining to his siblings that Alicia wouldn't fight a divorce because she was too desperate to be loved and trained to think she's lucky I stayed. He outlined his plan methodically. Wait for the Jamaica money to clear, file divorce papers immediately, liquidate the house and split proceeds with Christine and Derek, put Sophia in whatever Medicaid facility would take her. His siblings asked questions about timeline and logistics. Nobody asked whether this was cruel or wrong, or whether destroying a woman who'd saved all of them made them the kind of people who deserved to sleep peacefully at night. Alicia listened to her mother's whispered prayers recorded in darkness. "Lord, please protect my daughter. She's so good, and she doesn't see what's right in front of her. Please help her understand before it's too late. I'm sorry I'm such a burden. I'm sorry she has to choose between me and her marriage. Please just let her be safe and happy. Take me if that's what needs to happen. Just keep her safe." The recordings captured meals where they gave Sophia stale bread and told her she should be grateful she wasn't on the street. They captured conversations where Christine suggested accidentally forgetting Sophia's blood pressure medication might solve everyone's problems naturally. They captured Derek's laughter when Sophia's hands shook too badly to hold her water glass and spilled it down her shirt. The kind of laughter that recognizes suffering and finds it amusing. The most devastating recording came from week 6. Richard's voice, probably drunk based on the slurring, speaking to Christine and Derek with absolute clarity about his intentions. Alicia's the kind of woman who thinks being useful makes her valuable. I've spent 8 years teaching her that she's boring, that her nursing stories are tedious, that the only interesting thing about her is what she can provide. She believes it now. She apologizes for talking about her work. She asks permission to spend her own money. She's been perfectly trained. When I file divorce papers, she'll be so focused on trying to understand what she did wrong that she won't notice us emptying accounts and selling assets. By the time she realizes, everything will be liquidated and split. Her mistake was thinking love was about more than transactions. My mistake was waiting this long to cash out. But then there was another recording. One Alicia almost missed because it was so quiet. Richard alone in what sounded like the bathroom, his voice barely a whisper. "What the hell am I doing? This isn't who I thought I'd become." A long pause. Then, "But I'm in too deep now. If I stop, I lose everything anyway. At least this way I get something out of it." The sound of water running. Then nothing. Derek's voice. "What if she fights back?" Richard's laugh, but it sounded hollow now that Alicia had heard that private moment. "With what? She gave me everything. Her inheritance bought this house. Her salary paid my debts. Her emotional labor held me together when I was falling apart. She's got nothing left to fight with. She spent it all on me. That's what makes her perfect. She's already empty." Alicia listened to this recording 3 times, hearing her husband reduce their 8-year marriage to a long con, hearing him laugh about how thoroughly he'd destroyed her sense of self-worth, but she also heard that moment of doubt, that instant when he'd almost chosen differently and didn't. That made it worse somehow, knowing he'd seen what he was becoming and chosen it anyway. She sat on that hotel bathroom floor until dawn, working through all the recordings chronologically, backing them up to multiple drives, understanding that her mother had documented everything because Sophia knew her daughter would never believe the truth. Without irrefutable evidence, Alicia had been raised to see the good in people, to give second chances, to believe love could overcome anything. Her mother had been raised in a different era, with different lessons, and she understood that sometimes the people you love most are the ones most capable of destroying you. When the recordings ended, Alicia started making phone calls with the kind of cold efficiency she used in the hospital, when patients were coding and emotions had to wait until the crisis passed. She called the real estate attorney who'd handled her house purchase, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who specialized in property law and women's rights. Patricia listened to selected recordings and spent an hour reviewing documents before explaining that Alicia had legal leverage most wives wouldn't have. The house had been purchased entirely with Alicia's inheritance before marriage. State law recognized inherited assets as separate property. Adding Richard's name to the deed was a gesture, not a requirement. Elder abuse charges gave Alicia grounds to remove Richard from the property immediately. The case was winnable, and Patricia would handle it personally. She called Jamaica Reynolds, her best friend from nursing school, who'd gone on to run a women's advocacy organization focused on domestic violence and financial abuse. Jamaica caught the next flight out, bringing legal resources and safe housing networks and a team of women who'd survived similar situations and knew exactly how abusers operated when their victims started fighting back. She called her former supervisor at the hospital, Dr. Teresa Harrison, who offered Alicia her old position back immediately at higher pay and connected her with the hospital's legal aid program that provided free support for employees facing family crises. Then Alicia did something unexpected. She called Richard's estranged aunt, Beatrice King, the family member Richard had cut off completely 5 years ago for causing drama at family gatherings. Beatrice arrived at the hotel within an hour, a 60-year-old woman with steel-grey hair and eyes that had witnessed too much suffering to believe in easy redemptions. She sat across from Alicia and listened to selected recordings without visible reaction, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully neutral. When the recordings ended, Beatrice was quiet for several minutes. Then she began talking about Richard's father. Charles King had married 3 times. Each wife entered the marriage with property, savings, or family money. Each wife left the marriage broken and poor, convinced she was the problem, carrying shame like a second skin. Richard's mother had been the second wife, a teacher with a pension and inherited property from her parents. Charles drained everything over 15 years, convinced her she was worthless without him, isolated her from friends and family who tried to intervene. She died working retail at 70, living in a studio apartment, apologizing to Beatrice for being a burden when she needed help affording her medications. Beatrice tried to warn Alicia before the wedding. She'd shown up at the engagement party with documentation of the family pattern, with stories about Charles's manipulation tactics, with desperate pleas for Alicia to reconsider. Richard had labeled her bitter and crazy, accused her of being jealous of his happiness, and cut her off completely. He'd made Alicia choose between him and his aunt, and Alicia had chosen him because that's what women in love do when the man they love presents the choice as proof of loyalty. Beatrice had been keeping records for 20 years, documenting the King family pattern of financial abuse and emotional destruction. She had newspaper clippings about Charles's bankruptcies, court records from his divorces, and interviews with his ex-wives describing identical manipulation tactics across decades. She knew about Derek's fraud charges in another state that he'd fled to avoid prosecution. She knew about Christine's embezzlement from her last employer who hadn't pressed charges to avoid negative publicity. She knew that Richard's business partner who'd disappeared with $50,000 was actually his college friend who'd helped stage the theft to claim bankruptcy fraudulently. "I've been waiting for someone to listen," Beatrice said, her voice steady. "I watched my brother destroy 3 women. I watched Richard learn every tactic from watching his father. I tried to stop it with you, and he cut me out. I kept these records because I knew eventually the pattern would repeat badly enough that someone would have to pay attention. I just hoped it wouldn't be too late for whoever was caught in it." Jamaica arrived, then Patricia, then Dr. Harrison. They gathered in that hotel room around documents and recordings and decades of family history, building a strategy with military precision. They outlined legal steps and safety protocols and timeline for actions that would dismantle Richard's life with the same thoroughness he'd planned to dismantle Alicia's. Alicia sat at the center of this circle of women who'd survived their own battles and learned to fight, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, but something harder. Determination. Clarity. The cold certainty that she was done being the woman Richard had trained her to be, and ready to become the woman she'd been before she let someone convince her that strength was the same as hardness and kindness was the same as weakness. "They wanted me broken," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 3 months in Jamaica and 8 years of slowly disappearing. "They bet everything on me staying broken. They're about to learn what happens when broken things refuse to stay shattered." Beatrice reached across the table and took Alicia's hand. "You're my sister-in-law's daughter in every way that matters. She would be so proud of you right now. Not for what you're about to do to them, but for what you're about to do for yourself." Outside the hotel window, dawn was breaking over the city. Alicia watched light spread across buildings and streets, erasing darkness inch by inch, and understood that sometimes destruction and creation are the same process, that sometimes you have to burn down everything you built on lies before you can start building on truth. Chapter 4. The fortress she built. Alicia moved through the next 72 hours with surgical precision, each action deliberate and documented, no wasted movement or emotion. First priority was Sophia's immediate care. She transferred her mother to Riverside Recovery, a private facility run by her colleague Teresa. The intake examination revealed stage 2 bed sores, malnutrition with significant weight loss, severe urinary tract infection, dehydration, and early pneumonia. Teresa documented everything with forensic detail. Alicia filed an elder abuse report with Adult Protective Services, providing medical evidence and audio recordings. Within 48 hours, a protective order was issued barring Richard, Christine, and Derek from contact with Sophia or from entering the property. She returned to work at the hospital, where her colleagues rallied immediately. Dr. Harrison connected Alicia with Patricia Okafor, a Nigerian-American family law attorney who took the case pro bono after listening to the recordings once Alicia legally separated all finances with documentation of Richard's complete dependence and audio proof of his planned fraud. She removed his access to every account, every credit card, every shared resource. Then came the moment that crystallized Richard's destruction. 3 days after being locked out, Richard went to an upscale menswear store to buy a cashmere coat, confident the Jamaica money had arrived. He selected something expensive that made him feel like the success he'd always claimed to be approaching. The clerk rang up the purchase. Declined. Richard tried another card. Declined. He tried the joint checking account. Declined. The clerk's expression shifted from helpful to suspicious. Other customers turned to watch. Richard's face burned with humiliation as he tried to explain there must be some mistake. He stepped outside and called the bank. The representative explained that Alicia King had legally separated all accounts 2 weeks prior, with court documentation of financial abuse patterns. Richard King had zero access. His personal account contained $37. His credit cards were maxed. The representative suggested he contact his attorney. Richard's phone exploded with texts from Christine and Derek. They were at a restaurant after expensive brunch. Cards declined. Manager threatening police. Richard had to beg his cousin to wire emergency money, explaining through gritted teeth that there was a temporary banking issue. That night, Richard, Christine, and Derek sat in another cousin's living room, trying to figure out what had happened to their lives. They had no money for hotels, no money for deposits, no savings. They were suddenly homeless, dependent on extended family who'd watched them live comfortably while contributing nothing. Richard tried to access the house. Police arrived with the protective order and escorted him away. He tried to argue the house was half his. Patricia sent documentation proving Alicia bought it entirely with premarital inheritance, that adding his name was a gesture, that elder abuse invalidated any equity claims. Throughout these days, darkly comic moments emerged as the siblings tried to maintain their social media presence. Derek posted selfies at his cousin's cramped apartment, angling shots to make it look trendy. Christine took photos at the public library, claiming she was at a chic cafe. Richard staged pictures with borrowed art supplies, implying major commissions. Meanwhile, Alicia began systematic moves. She contacted Derek's probation officer in Arizona with his current location. She reached out to Christine's former employer with documentation showing a pattern of crimes, and the company reconsidered prosecution. She provided insurance investigators with evidence that Richard's partner theft was staged fraud, bank records, text messages, proof the partner lived comfortably in Florida. Insurance companies don't appreciate fraud. Criminal investigations opened. Alicia also called mutual friends, not to gossip, but to calmly mention Richard might reach out claiming hardship, and they should know he was under investigation for elder abuse and insurance fraud. She said it matter-of-factly and let people draw their own conclusions. Richard appeared outside the house late one night, drunk enough to be brave. He stood screaming about his rights, about lawyers and police. Alicia opened the door calmly, backlit by warm light. "You're right that I can't do this alone, but the law can. Elder abuse is a felony. Insurance fraud is a felony. And Karma doesn't need my help anymore. You three are destroying yourselves beautifully without assistance from me." Richard tried to rush the door. Alicia stepped back and closed it, locking the deadbolt with a solid click. She returned to the living room where Sophia sat visiting for dinner, both women sharing tea, neither flinching when Richard resumed shouting. Eventually, neighbors called police. Officers arrived, found the protective order, and arrested Richard for violation. As they put him in the patrol car, he was still shouting about rights and legality. The officers had heard it before. They drove Richard away, while Alicia and Sophia sat inside drinking cold tea, both understanding that the hardest part wasn't fighting back, but accepting that fighting back was necessary. Chapter 5. The Allies Who Rose. The church ladies arrived first, which shouldn't have surprised anyone who understood that black women of a certain generation don't wait for invitations to protect their own sister. Geneva led the delegation, all 82 years of her contained in a 4'11" frame that somehow took up more space than physics should allow. She swept into Alicia's house with a casserole dish, 3 other church ladies behind her carrying enough food to feed an army, and announced that they would be providing meals every other day until Alicia's situation stabilized. This was not a request. This was how community worked, and Alicia would accept the help because refusing would be disrespectful to women who understood struggle and wouldn't let one of their own face it alone. The church ladies had been watching Richard for years with the kind of quiet assessment women learn when their survival depends on reading men accurately. They'd noticed how he never volunteered for service projects, how he smiled when people praised Alicia's work but never added his own praise, how he talked about his art career in ways that made it sound successful while Alicia worked double shifts to pay their bills. They'd stayed silent because Alicia seemed happy, because marriage is private, because you don't interfere unless asked. Now they were done staying silent. When Richard tried to attend service the following Sunday, probably hoping the church community would encourage Christian forgiveness and reconciliation, Sister Geneva positioned herself at the entrance like a holy bouncer. "Boy, I changed your diaper when your mama brought you here as a baby," she said loud enough for everyone in the vestibule to hear. "You were nasty then, and you're nastier now. The difference is babies grow up. You just got meaner. Get out of this house of God before God throws you out himself." The congregation behind her murmured agreement. Richard tried to push past, claiming he had every right to attend church. Sister Geneva didn't move. 3 more church ladies materialized beside her, forming a human wall of righteous fury and Sunday hats. The pastor emerged from his office, took in the situation, and told Richard firmly that he was not welcome until he'd made amends for abusing an elder, a crime that violated every principle their church stood on. Richard left, humiliated and furious, while the congregation closed ranks around Alicia and sang louder than usual during service, their voices carrying defiance and protection. In equal measure, Jamaica Reynolds arrived with her entire advocacy organization infrastructure. She brought legal resources, media contacts, safe housing networks, and most importantly, a team of women who'd survived narcissistic abuse and financial exploitation and knew exactly how abusers operated when their victims started fighting back. They helped Alicia install security cameras around the house, change her phone number, and set up alert systems that would notify police if Richard violated the protective order again. They also provided something more valuable than logistics. They provided testimony that Alicia wasn't crazy or vindictive or misunderstanding the situation. They shared their own stories of charming men who slowly eroded their sense of self-worth, of partners who presented one face to the world and another behind closed doors, of the specific ways financial abuse works to trap women in situations they can't easily escape. Alicia listened to their stories and recognized her own, understood she wasn't alone in having loved someone who weaponized that love against her. Dr. Harrison became more than a supervisor. She became a mentor and advocate, personally vouching for Alicia's character to anyone who asked and shutting down workplace gossip before it could spread. She connected Alicia with support groups for domestic abuse survivors and encouraged her to pursue leadership roles in elder care that would let her turn this experience into systemic change. She also made it clear that the hospital stood behind Alicia completely, that any harassment from Richard on hospital property would result in immediate arrest and trespassing charges. Patricia Okafor moved through the legal system like a force of nature, filing motions and building a case so airtight that Richard's public defender could barely mount a defense. She compiled medical evidence, audio recordings, financial documents, and witness testimony into a narrative that would make any jury understand exactly what Richard had done and why he deserved maximum consequences. Meanwhile, Richard's world continued its systematic collapse. The insurance investigation accelerated when investigators interviewed the supposed business partner and discovered significant inconsistencies in his story. Bank records showed transfers that predated the claimed theft. Text messages revealed planning conversations. The partner, facing his own criminal charges, decided cooperation might reduce his sentence and provided detailed testimony about Richard's fraud scheme Derek was arrested when he tried to use his credit card at a gas station and triggered an outstanding warrant. He was extradited to Arizona to face fraud charges from a rental property scam he'd run years before, leaving multiple families homeless after collecting deposits and first month's rent on properties he didn't own. He'd fled before prosecution, assuming distance would protect him. Alicia's call to his probation officer had ended that protection. Christine lost a promising job opportunity when background checks revealed her embezzlement history. Her former employer, seeing the pattern and emboldened by Alicia's willingness to pursue justice, decided to prosecute after all. Christine was arrested at her cousin's house and charged with felony theft. The King siblings, once so united in their exploitation of Alicia, turned on each other viciously under the pressure of individual consequences. Derek blamed Christine for suggesting they mistreat Sophia. Christine blamed Richard for orchestrating everything. Richard blamed both of them for being too obvious about the abuse and drawing attention to their situation. Aunt Beatrice became a crucial part of Alicia's support system, providing not just family history, but ongoing guidance. She explained the King family pattern in detail, how the men learned manipulation from watching their fathers, how the cycle repeated across generations, how Richard had been trained from childhood to see women as resources to be extracted rather than people to be loved. She'd kept documentation for 20 years because she'd watched her brother destroy 3 women and refused to let the pattern continue without consequence. She also provided tactical advice. "Richard will try to make you feel guilty," Beatrice warned. "He'll cry and claim he's changed and explain that his childhood trauma made him act this way. Don't listen. His father used the same tactics. Trauma explains behavior. It doesn't excuse it. Every person who survives trauma has to choose whether to perpetuate cycles or break them. Richard chose perpetuation. Let him live with that choice." Sophia's recovery at Riverside accelerated with proper care. Her bed sores healed, her infection cleared. Her malnutrition reversed. Her speech improved dramatically. But more than physical healing, her personality re-emerged. She was funny, it turned out, with a sharp wit she'd suppressed during months of abuse. She made nurses laugh with observations about Richard's incompetence and Christine's pretensions. She told stories about young Alicia that reminded her daughter of who she'd been before she dimmed herself to accommodate Richard's fragile ego. There was a scene one afternoon when Alicia visited Riverside and found her mother holding court with the nursing staff, telling them about the time Richard tried to cook rice and somehow started a fire, about how he couldn't change a light bulb without complaining about manual labor being beneath his artistic hands, about how he'd once gotten lost driving to the grocery store they'd shopped at for years because he'd never actually paid attention to where anything was. The nurses were crying with laughter. Sophia was animated and bright, more alive than Alicia had seen her in years. When she noticed her daughter, Sophia's expression softened. "Come here, baby girl. I was just explaining to these lovely ladies how you married a man who couldn't find his way out of a paper bag without GPS and a detailed instruction manual." Alicia sat beside her mother and laughed until tears came, not from humor, but from relief that Sophia was still herself underneath the trauma, that the stroke and abuse hadn't erased the strong woman who'd raised her to be stronger. That evening, they sat together in Sophia's room watching the sun set through her window, and Sophia took Alicia's hand. "I need you to understand something," she said carefully. "I never liked him. From the beginning I saw what he was. But you loved him, and I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe love would change him. Maybe I was just being protective. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to be the mother who ruined her daughter's happiness. I'm sorry I stayed quiet. I should have trusted that you were strong enough to hear the truth." Alicia squeezed her mother's hand. "I wouldn't have listened. I was so determined to make it work, to prove that love and effort could overcome anything I needed to learn this lesson myself. But I'm grateful you documented everything, Mama. Without those recordings, I'd still be wondering if I misunderstood, if I was being too harsh, If I should give him another chance, you gave me proof I couldn't rationalize away. Sophia smiled. That's what mothers do, baby. We document the truth so our daughters can see it when they're ready. The community that formed around Alicia during those weeks was powerful and protective. Church ladies patrolled her street, taking note of any cars that didn't belong. Hospital colleagues walked her to her car after shifts. Jamaica's organization provided overnight support when needed. Aunt Beatrice called daily to check in and provide encouragement. And through it all, Alicia felt herself transforming from the woman who tried to shrink herself small enough to fit into Richard's vision of who she should be, back into the woman she'd been before she learned that some people will take everything you offer and convince you it was never enough. Chapter 6. The Unraveling. They caused. Richard's desperation metastasized into increasingly poor decisions that documented themselves without Alicia needing to pursue him at all. He hired a lawyer from a late-night television ad who filed motions claiming Richard deserved compensation for home improvements and 8 years of emotional labor supporting Alicia's career. Patricia Okafor destroyed these arguments with receipts showing Alicia paid contractors for everything and Richard's social media posts where he celebrated never doing his own repairs. Richard tried rallying mutual friends with a gathering at his cousin's apartment. Most declined. Those who attended left early when his story collapsed under basic questioning. Someone mentioned the medical documentation of abuse. Someone else brought up the recordings. His narrative required believing Alicia was simultaneously incompetent and calculating, weak and cold enough to destroy a man who loved her. The contradictions were obvious. Several friends messaged Alicia privately afterward to apologize. Their apologies felt hollow. They'd had years to speak up. But she accepted them because holding grudges required energy she needed elsewhere. Richard tried social media, posting about betrayal and abandonment. Jamaica strategically leaked edited audio to a domestic abuse blog. The clips were brief but damning. Richard laughing about training Alicia, planning to institutionalize Sophia, celebrating extracting everything while offering nothing. The post went viral locally. Comments filled with people who knew Richard, who suddenly recognized they'd watched financial abuse while thinking it was normal marriage dynamics. Richard's professional contacts vanished. Gallery owners decided association with elder abuse was bad for business. The King siblings fractured completely under pressure. Derek blamed Christine, providing investigators with texts showing she'd mocked Sophia most viciously. Christine blamed Richard, providing recordings where he'd outlined his divorce plan. Richard blamed them both for being too obvious. They sold each other out efficiently, revealing they'd never actually loved each other beyond shared benefit from exploiting someone else's resources. More people came forward with stories. An ex-girlfriend showed Patricia documentation of Richard borrowing thousands he never repaid, breaking up when she asked for the money back. Another woman shared that Richard convinced her to invest in his gallery, used her money for personal expenses, then claimed the gallery failed because she hadn't invested enough. A former roommate revealed Richard stole his laptop and sold it. The pattern stretched back 15 years. Each person had absorbed the loss quietly, blamed themselves, moved on without pursuing justice. Seeing each other's stories made them realize the pattern was Richard's. Miguel, Richard's childhood friend, contacted Alicia drowning in guilt. He provided texts from years ago where Richard bragged about training Alicia like a rescue dog. Miguel admitted he'd thought it was crude guy talk. Hearing the elder abuse recordings made him realize Richard had been serious. Throughout this unraveling, Alicia remained centered. She didn't engage with Richard's social media or respond to messages sent through acquaintances. She went to work, visited her mother, attended therapy, built her legal case, and refused to let Richard occupy emotional space. But the legal process moved slower than she'd expected. Protective orders were temporary and required renewal hearings, where Richard's lawyer argued he was being denied due process. Court dates got postponed. Richard filed motions claiming the recordings were illegally obtained. Patricia had to counter each delay with evidence and legal precedent. There were moments Alicia wondered if justice would actually come, or if Richard would find some loophole that let him escape consequences. Patricia assured her the case was solid, but the wheels of justice turned slowly, especially when defendants had lawyers filing endless procedural objections. "This is normal," Patricia said. "Frustrating, but normal. His lawyer is throwing everything at the wall, hoping something sticks. Nothing will, but it takes time to prove that to the court's satisfaction." The chapter ended with Richard being served with divorce papers and formal elder abuse charges after weeks of legal maneuvering. His public defender asked if Richard understood the severity. Richard screamed, "How did she become so powerful? She was nothing without me." The public defender looked at him with contempt. "You're about to find out she was everything without you, and you're nothing without her money. That's what happens when you build your life on someone else's foundation and think you're the architect." Chapter 7. The Reckoning That Echoed. The courthouse steps were granite, worn smooth by decades of people climbing toward justice or fleeing from it, and Alicia climbed them surrounded by women who'd learned that justice was something you built rather than something you were given. Patricia Okafor walked beside her, carrying 3 file boxes of evidence that would dismantle every lie Richard had told himself, and everyone else. Jamaica Reynolds held Alicia's left hand. Dr. Harrison held her right. Behind them came Sister Geneva and the church ladies, Aunt Beatrice with her 20 years of family documentation, nursing colleagues from the hospital, volunteers from the advocacy organization, and Sophia in her wheelchair, pushed by her physical therapist from Riverside Recovery. The gallery was full before Richard's lawyer even arrived, a show of community support that made it clear who this neighborhood believed and who they were prepared to protect. Richard sat at the defense table looking smaller than Alicia remembered, like someone had let air out of him slowly over the past months. His public defender, a tired-looking woman who handled too many cases for too little pay, reviewed notes without enthusiasm. Christine sat in the back row in handcuffs, transported from jail to testify. Derek appeared via video conference from Arizona, his face grainy on the screen, but his orange jumpsuit clear enough. Judge Constance Williams entered, an older black woman whose reputation was legendary for giving powerful sentences to abusers who thought they could charm their way out of consequences. She'd spent 30 years on the bench watching men like Richard destroy women like Alicia, and she developed zero tolerance for manipulation disguised as remorse. Patricia Okafor opened with devastating precision. She presented the house purchase documents proving Alicia's sole financial contribution. She submitted receipts showing 8 years of Alicia supporting Richard entirely while he contributed nothing beyond excuses and artistic aspirations. She played the audio recordings chronologically so the jury could hear Richard's plan unfold in his own voice. The way he discussed training Alicia to believe she was worthless, the calculations about divorce timing, the cold assessment that love was transactional, and he'd maximized his extraction of resources. But she also played that quiet moment, Richard alone, whispering about what he was becoming, questioning himself, then choosing to continue anyway. "The prosecution wants you to understand," Patricia said, "that this wasn't a man who didn't know better. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing, questioned whether it was right, and chose cruelty anyway because it was easier than being decent." The jury sat forward in their chairs, riveted and horrified. Several jurors were visibly angry. One woman in the front row wiped her eyes when the recording of Sophia's prayers played, the old woman's voice shaking as she begged God to protect her daughter from a man who was systematically destroying her. Richard's lawyer objected repeatedly, claiming the recordings were inadmissible or taken out of context. Judge Williams overruled every objection with barely concealed irritation. "Counsel, your client recorded himself explaining his intention to commit fraud and elder abuse. The context is clear. Proceed with your defense if you have one." The medical documentation came next. Teresa from Riverside testified about Sophia's condition on intake, bed sores, malnutrition, dehydration, infection, pneumonia. She showed photographs that made jurors gasp. She explained in clinical detail what 3 months of systematic neglect does to a stroke survivor's body, how the injuries Sophia sustained required intentional disregard for basic human dignity, how these weren't accidents, but the inevitable result of treating a vulnerable person like they were disposable. Financial records came next, showing Alicia's consistent income over 8 years. While Richard contributed virtually nothing, Patricia highlighted specific expenditures. Alicia paying off Richard's debt. Alicia covering his siblings' expenses. Alicia funding every household cost, while Richard's only financial contribution was spending money Alicia earned. Derek testified via video to reduce his own charges, providing detailed accounts of Richard orchestrating the abuse. He described how Richard had coached them on what to say during Alicia's phone calls, how Richard had staged photos to make Sophia look cared for, how Richard had explicitly stated his plan to divorce Alicia immediately after receiving the Jamaica money. Derek's testimony was self-serving, but corroborated by audio evidence that made lying pointless. Christine testified in person, hands cuffed, wearing jail scrubs instead of the designer clothes she'd worn while living in Alicia's house. She described Richard's manipulation tactics, how he'd convinced them Alicia deserved mistreatment because she was controlling with her unreasonable demands that they contribute to expenses and treat Sophia with dignity. She painted Richard as the mastermind and herself as a follower, which might have been more convincing if the audio recordings didn't capture her suggesting ways to hasten Sophia's death through medication, accidents. Aunt Beatrice took the stand and carried decades of suppressed rage into her testimony. She described watching her brother Charles destroy 3 women using identical tactics Richard had learned by observation. She provided her meticulously kept documentation, court records, newspaper clippings, interviews with Charles's ex-wives describing manipulation patterns that matched Richard's behavior exactly. She looked directly at Richard when she said, "Your father died alone because he destroyed everyone who loved him. You followed his path, thinking you were smarter, thinking you wouldn't get caught. You were never smarter, you were just patient. And now you're facing the same fate he did, alone, exposed, and wondering why everyone abandoned you, when the truth is you abandoned your own humanity years ago." Multiple character witnesses testified for Alicia. Dr. Harrison described her professional excellence and advocacy for vulnerable patients. Jamaica Reynolds explained Alicia's volunteer work with abuse survivors. Sister Geneva characterized Alicia's community service and moral integrity. Richard's character witnesses were notably absent. Even his cousin, who'd provided temporary housing, refused to testify, unwilling to perjure himself by claiming Richard had positive character traits. During breaks, Richard tried to approach various people seeking sympathy. He cornered Aunt Beatrice in the courthouse hallway, perhaps hoping family connection might inspire mercy. "Aunt B, please," he said, his voice cracking with practiced emotion. "Your family. You know what it was like growing up with Dad. You know I learned all the wrong things. How can you do this to me? After everything our family's been through." Beatrice turned to face him fully, and everything she'd held back for 30 years erupted. "Family. You cut me out of your life because I told the truth about your father. You called me bitter and jealous when I tried to warn Alicia. I watched your father destroy 3 women exactly the way you're destroying Alicia. Your mother, my sister-in-law, died believing she was worthless because Charles spent 30 years convincing her she died working retail, living in a studio apartment, apologizing for being a burden. I held her hand in hospice. I promised her I wouldn't let this pattern continue. When I tried to save Alicia, you made her choose between you and me, and she chose you because that's what abuse victims do. I stayed silent with your mother because I was young and scared. I tried to warn Alicia, and you silenced me. I will not make that mistake again. You had every chance to break this cycle. You chose to perfect it instead. You're your father's son in every way that matters. And just like him, you're going to end up with nothing because you treated people like they were nothing." Richard tried to respond, reaching for her arm, but Beatrice stepped back sharply. "Don't touch me. You lost the right to family connection when you chose cruelty over character." She walked away with her spine straight and her head high, leaving Richard in that hallway, finally understanding that his family history wasn't a justification, but an indictment. When Sophia took the stand, the courtroom went silent, with the kind of respect reserved for people who've survived what should have destroyed them. Her speech was still affected by the stroke, but much stronger now, clear enough that every word carried weight. She described 3 months of systematic cruelty in calm, factual tones, being left in soiled clothes for hours, being given spoiled food while watching them eat fresh meals, being mocked for her disability, being isolated in a cold room, listening through walls as Richard planned to abandon her to state care once he'd extracted the Jamaica money from her daughter. Her voice shook when she described praying for death because she believed she was a burden. "I thought my daughter would be better off if I died," Sophia said, looking directly at the jury. "That's what they wanted me to believe. That's what abuse does. It makes you think you're the problem." Then I realized those prayers were exactly what Richard wanted. He wanted me to give up, to die conveniently so he wouldn't have to deal with the messiness of disposing of me some other way. That made me angry, and anger kept me alive, long enough for my daughter to come home and see the truth. She looked at Richard then, and her expression held no forgiveness or understanding or even hatred. Just cold assessment of someone who'd revealed himself as fundamentally worthless. "You tried to convince my daughter she needed you. You tried to convince me I was a burden. You were wrong about both of us. We're stronger than you ever understood, and we're fine without you. Better than fine. We're free." The gallery erupted in applause before Judge Williams could bang her gavel for order. Richard's lawyer objected to the emotional display. Judge Williams said dryly, "Counsel, your client abused an elderly stroke victim while planning to steal from the woman who saved him from bankruptcy. If the gallery wants to applaud truth-telling, I'm not stopping them." Outside the courthouse during lunch break, reporters gathered. One asked Richard for comment on the testimony. Richard tried his charm, his wounded artist routine, his claims of misunderstanding. A reporter asked directly, "Mr. King, multiple witnesses testified that you planned to institutionalize your mother-in-law and divorce your wife after receiving money she earned. How do you respond?" Richard's mask slipped. "The recordings are out of context. Everyone's ganging up on me because Alicia's manipulating them. I'm the victim here. She destroyed my reputation, my career, everything, all because I wanted a divorce from a controlling woman who made my life miserable." Another reporter, "If you wanted a divorce, why wait until after receiving the Jamaica property money?" Richard's face reddened. "That's not, I wasn't. She's twisting everything. This is character assassination." Alicia emerged from the courthouse at that moment, surrounded by her legal team and community. A reporter asked her directly, "Mrs. Moss, do you have a response to your ex-husband's claims that you're manipulating the situation?" Alicia stopped, considered carefully, then spoke with the quiet authority of someone who'd found her power through nearly losing it. "I learned something important through this process. Abusers don't see themselves as abusers. They see themselves as victims of the people who refuse to be victimized anymore. My husband spent 8 years convincing me I was worthless without him. He's now spending his days trying to convince anyone who'll listen that he's worthless without my money. The difference is, I know my worth now, and it was never, ever dependent on him seeing it." The supporters behind her applauded. Richard tried to approach, shouting, "We once loved each other. Doesn't that mean anything?" Alicia didn't turn around. She simply walked to her car while Patricia stepped between them like a human shield. But the trial took weeks, not days. There were continuances when Richard's lawyer claimed he needed more time to prepare. There were evidentiary hearings about which recordings could be admitted. There were jury selection delays and procedural motions. Alicia had to take time off work repeatedly to attend court sessions. The process was exhausting and frustrating, and there were moments she wondered if dragging it out was Richard's final way of controlling her time and energy. Patricia reminded her that this was normal, that Richard's lawyer was using every available delay tactic, but that none of it would change the outcome. "Justice is slow," Patricia said, "but it's coming. Every delay just gives us more time to build an even stronger case." Finally, Judge Williams delivered her verdict with the weight of decades spent watching similar cases. Richard received full criminal charges for elder abuse and insurance fraud, no claim to the house or Alicia's assets, substantial restitution for Sophia's medical expenses, and a permanent restraining order. As the judge read the verdict, Richard collapsed in his chair, finally understanding that his charm and manipulation and victim narrative had all failed against the simple truth of what he'd done. The gallery erupted again, this time with genuine celebration. Sophia reached for Alicia's hand and squeezed it tight, and they sat together, watching Richard's world end the way hers had almost ended, suddenly, completely, and with no one left who believed his lies about why it was happening to him instead of by him. Chapter 8. The Empire She Claimed. The house felt different when Alicia walked through it alone for the first time in weeks, like a body recovering from illness and testing its strength carefully before trusting its own healing. She'd received the house entirely in the divorce settlement. Richard's name was removed from the deed with a judge's signature that felt more powerful than any vow they'd exchanged. She'd also received a financial settlement covering 8 years of supporting him, plus restitution for Sophia's medical expenses and ongoing care costs. The total came to just over $75,000, which didn't come close to covering what she'd actually spent on Richard, but represented more than he deserved, and more than he could ever pay from his current employment arranging furniture displays at a discount home goods store. The Jamaica property money, $400,000 Richard had never managed to touch, remained entirely hers, but Alicia didn't just take this money and hide. She understood what it represented, what her grandmother's house had meant to generations of her family, and she honored that legacy with deliberate choices that felt like reclaiming more than money. She established the Winfrey Moss Scholarship Fund with $50,000, providing full nursing school scholarships for young Jamaican women who showed the kind of determination Alicia remembered from her own education. She donated $25,000 to restore the community center in her grandmother's village that had served as hurricane shelter, medical clinic, and gathering space for decades. She set aside $50,000 in a trust for Sophia's long-term care needs. The rest she invested carefully, diversifying into index funds and purchasing a small rental property that would generate passive income while appreciating in value. She transformed the house systematically, erasing Richard's presence like a surgeon removing diseased tissue. She repainted walls in deep teals and warm golds, colors Richard had called too bold and unsophisticated. She replaced his minimalist furniture with pieces that felt like home. Comfortable couches that invited sitting instead of just looking stylish, bookcases filled with novels instead of art theory books Richard had bought to seem intellectual and never read, plants that brought life into spaces that had felt cold and performative. She converted the downstairs office into a fully accessible suite for Sophia. She hired contractors to install a roll-in shower, widen doorways, add grab bars, and adjustable counters. She created a sitting area that opened onto the garden with French doors wide enough for wheelchair access. The room was bright and warm and designed around Sophia's needs rather than around aesthetic principles that prioritized appearance over function. Sophia moved in with a full-time care aide Alicia hired, a woman named Grace who treated Sophia with genuine affection and respect. Sophia's health improved dramatically with proper care, nutrition, consistent medication management, and physical therapy. She regained significant mobility in her affected side. Her speech continued clarifying. Her depression lifted. Mother and daughter built a relationship of mutual respect and joy, sharing morning coffee on the patio, laughing at cooking shows, planning a garden that would bloom in spring. There was a beautiful evening when they planted herbs together, Sophia directing from her wheelchair, while Alicia dug and positioned plants according to her mother's instructions. They laughed about Richard's complete inability to keep anything alive, remembered the time he'd killed a cactus through aggressive overwatering, marveled at how a grown man could be so incompetent at basic life tasks while maintaining such confidence in his own superiority. "I'm not glad you went through this," Sophia said carefully, running rosemary leaves through her fingers and breathing the scent. "But I'm glad you learned what you're capable of without someone diminishing you. You were always this strong, baby. You just forgot for a while." Alicia knelt beside her mother's wheelchair and rested her head against Sophia's knee like she had as a child. "I'm grateful you documented everything, Mama. Without that proof, I'd still be wondering if I'd misunderstood, if I was being too harsh, if I should have tried harder." Sophia stroked her daughter's hair. "That's what they count on. That's how abuse works. They make you doubt your own reality until you can't trust yourself. I documented because I knew you'd need proof you couldn't rationalize away. I knew my baby girl was strong enough to fight back once she understood she was fighting for her life and not just her marriage." Alicia invested in her career with the same strategic focus she'd applied to her legal case. She completed her nurse management certification and moved into a clinical nurse specialist position focused on elder care protocols. Her supervisor, Dr. Harrison, mentored her through developing hospital-wide programs for identifying and reporting elder abuse, making systematic change that would help other families recognize abuse before it became catastrophic. She began speaking at community events about financial abuse patterns and elder neglect, sharing her story not for sympathy, but as education. Local radio programs invited her to discuss warning signs. Advocacy organizations asked her to train their volunteers. She became known for frank discussions about how abuse operates through gradual erosion rather than dramatic violence, how smart women fall victim to skilled manipulators, how economic dependence traps people in situations they can't easily escape. Her work with Jamaica Reynolds' advocacy organization expanded into a local chapter focused specifically on helping women exit financially abusive situations. Alicia volunteered leading support groups where women shared stories and recognized their experiences in each other's narratives. She helped women understand that strength isn't staying in situations that destroy you. Sometimes strength is leaving before you lose yourself completely. There were moments of rediscovery that felt like coming home to herself. She took pottery classes at the community center, something Richard had mocked as arts and crafts for housewives, but that she found meditative and satisfying. She traveled to New Orleans for a nursing conference and stayed extra days to explore the city, eating beignets and walking through the French Quarter and remembering she loved travel and new experiences. She decorated her house with colorful paintings from black artists at local galleries, pieces Richard would have dismissed as too ethnic, but that made her walls feel alive. She dated casually. There was a high school history teacher who made her laugh, a hospital administrator who cooked elaborate meals, an engineer who listened when she talked and remembered details from their conversations. She wasn't looking for someone to complete her, because she was complete. She wasn't looking to replace Richard, because Richard had never actually filled the space he'd occupied, just taken up room that belonged to her. Meanwhile, Richard's decline continued with the inevitability of someone who'd built everything on someone else's foundation. He was living with his cousin who charged rent. Richard struggled to pay from his furniture store wages. His art career was completely dead. His social media presence devolved into inspirational quotes about betrayal and vague posts about narcissistic exes. His friends stopped engaging. His follower count dropped. He was becoming invisible, irrelevant, exactly what he'd always feared being underneath his carefully constructed artist persona. Christine was serving 18 months in minimum security prison for embezzlement. Derek was fighting fraud charges across 2 states and living with extended family who treated him like the burden he'd become. The King siblings, who'd been so united while exploiting Alicia, had completely fractured, each one alone and facing consequences for choices they'd made collectively. There was a particularly funny afternoon when Alicia ran into Richard at the grocery store. She was shopping with Jamaica, both of them laughing about something as they turned into the produce section. Richard stood alone near the bananas, his cart containing ramen and frozen dinners, and the kind of cheap processed food they used to eat before Alicia's income allowed better choices. He looked up, saw her, and his whole body tensed like he was preparing for confrontation or escape. Before he could decide which, Sister Geneva appeared from the next aisle, pushing her cart with surprising speed for an 82-year-old woman. She positioned herself directly between Alicia and Richard, effectively blocking his path and his view. "Alicia, honey," Sister Geneva said loudly, completely ignoring Richard's presence. "Did you find the good sweet potatoes? I'm making my candied yams for the church potluck. And you know yours need to be perfect for everyone who will be asking for the recipe, even though I give it out every year and somehow nobody's version tastes like mine." 3 more church ladies materialized from various aisles, forming a protective circle around Alicia and Jamaica. They chatted about recipes and upcoming events and Sister Geneva's grandson's new baby, creating a bubble of conversation that completely excluded Richard, while making it clear his presence was noted and dismissed. Richard stood there with his sad cart, watching the community that used to include him now function perfectly without him. And Alicia saw something break in his expression. Not remorse exactly, but recognition that he'd destroyed something he couldn't rebuild, that the comfortable life he'd taken for granted was gone forever because he'd treated people like resources instead of humans. The church ladies eventually moved on, taking Alicia and Jamaica with them toward the checkout lanes. Richard remained in produce, alone with his cheap groceries and the weight of understanding that this was his life now, not temporarily, not until he figured out his next move, but permanently, because he'd burned every bridge and alienated every person who'd ever cared about him. That evening, Alicia received an award from the Regional Hospital Association for her work developing elder abuse identification protocols. She stood on stage in a hotel ballroom accepting the recognition, and her acceptance speech focused on the reality that abuse thrives in silence, that speaking truth and building community protection matters more than any individual recognition. "Sometimes the greatest gift," she said, "is discovering you never needed someone who convinced you they were essential. Sometimes the best revenge is building a life so beautiful that the person who tried to destroy you can't even recognize their own shadow in it anymore. And sometimes the most important work we do isn't saving people, but teaching them how to save themselves." The audience, full of nurses and hospital administrators and community advocates, gave her a standing ovation. Sophia sat in the front row in her wheelchair, beaming with pride. Jamaica and Dr. Harrison flanked her, both women crying happily. The church ladies had bought a table and wore their Sunday best. Aunt Beatrice sat with them, finally part of a family celebration after years of exclusion. Alicia looked out at this community she'd built and rebuilt, at all the people who'd shown up when she needed them, and understood that she'd never been alone, even when Richard had tried to isolate her from everyone who actually loved her. She'd just forgotten temporarily that strength isn't individual achievement, but collective care, and that the people who truly love you don't make you smaller to fit their vision, but help you remember how big you've always been. Chapter 9. The Ghosts That Lingered. The nightmares started 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, which surprised Alicia because she'd thought the legal victory would bring peace instead of these midnight awakenings where her heart pounded and her sheets were damp with sweat from dreams she couldn't quite remember, but that left her feeling hunted. She'd wake at 3 in the morning with Richard's voice echoing in her head, all the small comments over 8 years that she'd dismissed as jokes or bad moods or stress. You're not that interesting without the financial stability you provide. Other women are more fun, but at least you're useful. I settle for boring because you settle for someone out of your league. Each comment had felt like a minor cut at the time, something she could bandage with excuses about his artistic temperament or childhood trauma. Collected together in these sleepless hours, they revealed themselves as systematic destruction, a calculated campaign to convince her she was worthless, so she'd accept whatever treatment he offered as more than she deserved. She started therapy with Dr. Keisha Williams, a psychologist who specialized in narcissistic abuse recovery and came highly recommended by Jamaica's advocacy organization. Dr. Williams was a black woman, around 50, with kind eyes and an absolute refusal to let Alicia minimize or rationalize anything that had happened to her. Their first session, Alicia tried to explain herself. "I just need to understand why I stayed so long. I'm educated. I'm financially independent. I should have seen this coming. I should have left years ago. I'm angry at myself for being so stupid." Dr. Williams stopped her gently but firmly. "Let's establish something right now. You are not stupid. Intelligent, successful women fall victim to narcissistic abuse regularly because narcissists are skilled at identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities. They don't reveal their true nature immediately. They reveal it incrementally, each boundary violation small enough to rationalize, each disrespect minor enough to forgive. You didn't stay because you're stupid. You stayed because you're loyal and hopeful and committed to the promises you make, and he weaponized those virtues against you. They worked through specific techniques abusers use. Dr. Williams taught Alicia about JADE. Never justify, argue, defend, or explain yourself to manipulators because it gives them ammunition and implies you owe them explanations for your own reality. She taught the grey rock method, becoming boring and unresponsive to people who feed on emotional reactions. She taught DARVO recognition, deny the abuse happened, attack the victim for calling it out, reverse victim and offender by claiming they're the one being abused. Armed with this education, Alicia reviewed Richard's letters that had started arriving through various channels. The restraining order prevented direct contact, so Richard sent letters through his lawyer, through mutual acquaintances who didn't know better, even through new social media accounts he created specifically to reach her. The letters followed predictable patterns Dr. Williams had described. The first letter was all charm and nostalgia. "Remember when we first met at the auction? Remember our weekend in the mountains? Remember how we used to talk for hours about everything and nothing? I miss that. I miss you. Whatever mistakes I made, we were good together once. Can't we find that again?" The second letter escalated to claims of change. "I've been in therapy. I'm understanding things about myself. I see now how my father's behavior affected me, how I repeated patterns I didn't recognize. I'm not that person anymore. I'm working on becoming the man I should have been. Give me a chance to prove it." The third letter shifted to veiled threats. "My lawyer says there might be grounds to challenge the divorce settlement. New evidence suggests the recordings were edited. I'm not saying I will challenge it, but I could, unless we could talk and settle things privately, away from lawyers and courts." The fourth letter plunged into desperate pleading. "I can't eat, I can't sleep, I can't work. Everyone's abandoned me. My family hates me. I have nothing left. You're the only person who ever understood me. Please, just one conversation, just 5 minutes. I'm begging you." Dr. Williams helped Alicia dissect each letter, identifying manipulation techniques in every sentence. The nostalgia letter never acknowledged specific harms, just romanticized a past that had been built on exploitation. The change letter described therapy, but offered no concrete examples of changed behavior or accountability for specific actions. The threat letter was intimidation disguised as information sharing. The pleading letter weaponized his suffering to make her responsible for his emotional state. "He's not writing to you," Dr. Williams explained. "He's writing to the version of you he trained to feel guilty for his problems and responsible for his happiness. That version doesn't exist anymore, but he's still trying to activate her because that's the only relationship dynamic he knows. When you don't respond, he escalates because silence breaks the pattern he's used to controlling." Alicia brought all the letters to Patricia Okafor, who filed restraining order violations for the ones that exceeded legal boundaries. Richard's continued contact wasn't about love or regret. It was about maintaining control, about refusing to accept that he'd lost access to someone he considered his resource. Richard's life continued downward. Criminal sentencing for insurance fraud and elder abuse was approaching. Christine and Derek had cut all contact, each sibling desperate to distance themselves from Richard's toxicity while facing their own legal consequences. Aunt Beatrice reached out to Alicia with disturbing information from her documentation of family history. Charles King, Richard's father, had attempted similar reconciliation with his ex-wives after divorces finalized. When letters didn't work, he'd shown up at their workplaces. When workplace visits got him escorted out by security, he'd followed them home. When following led to police involvement, he'd escalated to threats. One ex-wife had to move states and change her name to escape his harassment. The pattern suggested Richard might not accept defeat quietly. Jamaica's advocacy organization helped Alicia increase security measures. More cameras installed at various angles, workplace notifications, so hospital security knew to watch for Richard. Varied routines, so she wasn't predictable. Alert systems that would notify police immediately if Richard appeared at the house. The measures felt extreme until Richard started showing up in places he shouldn't be. Alicia emerged from a hospital shift one evening to find Richard sitting in his car 3 spaces from hers, watching. She didn't approach or acknowledge him. She got in her car, locked the doors, called police, and sat recording on her phone while Richard eventually drove away before officers arrived. He showed up outside her church the following Sunday, sitting in a coffee shop across the street where he could see everyone entering and leaving. He drove slowly past her house multiple times late at night, not stopping but making his presence known. Each incident was documented, reported, and added to the growing file of restraining order violations. Each incident also added weight to the fear Alicia carried that Richard's desperation might escalate into something more dangerous than letters and surveillance. There was a crucial evening when Alicia almost responded to a letter that seemed particularly genuine. Richard wrote about specific memories, the night they stayed up talking until dawn after first meeting, the weekend they spent painting her apartment before moving in together, the morning she'd surprised him with breakfast in bed after he'd been rejected by a gallery. He described his failures in specific terms rather than vague apologies. He asked nothing from her except understanding that he recognized what he'd destroyed and would spend the rest of his life regretting it. Alicia drafted a response, explaining her perspective, hoping that genuine communication might bring closure they both needed. She wrote 3 pages, detailing how his treatment had affected her, offering forgiveness not for him, but for herself, suggesting they could both move forward with understanding, even without reconciliation. She showed the draft to Jamaica before sending it. Jamaica read it carefully, then looked at Alicia with gentle sadness. "This is beautiful writing. It's honest and generous and exactly what he doesn't deserve. Can I show you something?" Jamaica pulled out her own letters from her ex-husband, a man who'd financially abused her before she left and started the advocacy organization. The letters were nearly identical in structure to Richard's, same progression from nostalgia to change claims to threats to pleading, same specific memory details designed to prove authenticity, same requests for just one conversation. They all use the same playbook, Jamaica said. Specificity doesn't mean sincerity. It means he's gotten better at manipulation, learned what didn't work before and adjusted his approach. He's not writing because he's changed. He's writing because he hasn't changed, and he's desperate to re-establish contact and control. The moment you respond, even to tell him to stop contacting you, you've broken the silence and shown him that persistence works. That's all he needs to escalate. Alicia deleted her draft. She didn't respond to Richard's letter or any subsequent ones. She maintained absolute silence, even when it felt cruel, because Dr. Williams and Jamaica and Patricia all agreed that response of any kind was dangerous with someone who'd shown himself capable of systematic emotional abuse and financial exploitation. The chapter built to a climactic confrontation. Late one evening, Alicia returned home from dinner with friends to find Richard sitting on her front steps. He'd been there for hours based on the empty bottles scattered around him. He was drunk, his shirt untucked, his face swollen with crying and rage. He looked up when her car pulled into the driveway, and something ugly crossed his face. He stood up, stumbling slightly, and started screaming before Alicia could even turn off the engine. "You ruined my life. Everything was fine until you got vindictive. I made mistakes, and you destroyed me. You turned everyone against me. You took everything I had. 8 years I gave you, and this is how you repay me, by making me homeless and jobless and alone. I loved you, and you're treating me like I'm nothing." Alicia stayed in her car with doors locked, dialing 911 while keeping her phone positioned to record. Richard pounded on her car window hard enough that she worried it might shatter. "Just talk to me, 5 minutes. You owe me that much after everything. I supported you emotionally for years. I was there when you needed someone. How can you be so cold? How can you just throw away 8 years like they meant nothing?" Alicia cracked her window slightly, keeping her voice calm and steady despite her racing heart. "You didn't love me. You loved what I provided. Every consequence you're facing is from your own choices. You planned to exploit me, abandon my mother, and commit fraud. You're not sitting on my steps because I was vindictive. You're sitting on my steps because you got caught being cruel and the legal system held you accountable. Police are 3 minutes away. You need to leave now." Richard didn't leave. He slid down her car door until he was sitting on the pavement, sobbing. "I just wanted to apologize. I just wanted you to understand I'm sorry. Why won't you let me apologize?" "Because," Alicia said through the cracked window, "you're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry there were consequences. But you're not actually sorry for abusing my mother or planning to destroy me financially. You're just sorry your plan didn't work. That's not remorse. That's regret about failed manipulation. Now leave before you add another arrest to your record." Richard stayed until police arrived and arrested him for restraining order violation and trespassing. As they put him in handcuffs, he was still screaming about how unfair everything was, how he'd been wronged, how Alicia had destroyed an innocent man who'd only loved her. The officers had heard it before. They'd responded to enough domestic situations to recognize a man who couldn't accept accountability for his own destruction. They loaded Richard into the patrol car and drove him away, while Alicia sat in her own car, shaking with adrenaline and fear and relief. She called Sophia immediately. Her mother answered on the first ring, voice alert despite the late hour. "Baby girl, are you safe?" Alicia started crying, all the fear releasing in sobs. "I'm safe, Mama. He's gone. They arrested him. He can't come back." Sophia's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "He could only hurt you when you believed his lies. You don't believe them anymore. That's why he's desperate. He lost his power over you. Men like him can't survive without power over someone. Come home, baby. Grace and I are making tea. We'll sit up together and remember that you're powerful and he's pathetic, because that's the truth. And truth is what keeps us safe. Alicia drove home to her mother and her life and her hard-won peace, understanding that healing wasn't linear and recovery wasn't permanent, but required ongoing choice. The daily decision to remember her worth, even when someone who'd tried to steal it kept trying to convince her it had never existed at all. Chapter 10. The Morning That Broke. The sentencing hearing happened on a Tuesday morning when frost clung to grass and courthouse steps gleamed with ice. Alicia sat surrounded by her community, Patricia beside her, Sophia in her wheelchair with Grace nearby, Jamaica holding her left hand, Dr. Harrison on her right. Behind them sat Sister Geneva and the church ladies, Aunt Beatrice with her documentation, nurses from Riverside and the hospital. The gallery was full of witnesses to what happened when someone decided they were done being destroyed quietly. Richard sat at the defense table, looking erased. His public defender reviewed notes without energy. Judge Williams entered with decades of experience, watching men like Richard. She reviewed the case summary: elder abuse, insurance fraud, multiple restraining order violations, and her expression suggested appropriate consequences were coming. Richard's lawyer made a final plea about difficult history and mental health, suggesting rehabilitation over punishment. Judge Williams listened without reaction, then asked if Richard wanted to make a final statement. Richard stood shakily. Alicia wondered if months of consequences had created insight, if he'd finally understand what he'd done. Then he opened his mouth. "Your Honor, I'm the victim of a vindictive ex-wife who manipulated the legal system to destroy me. I made mistakes, but I was under tremendous pressure. I struggled to care for her mother after she abandoned us. The recordings are out of context. The financial records don't show emotional abuse I suffered. I've lost everything because she knew how to manipulate the system. I'm asking for mercy because I'm the real victim, and I hope truth will eventually matter more than revenge." The courtroom erupted. Judge Williams banged her gavel once. "Mr. King, I've presided here for 23 years. I've heard every excuse. What I heard was self-pity disguised as accountability. You had multiple opportunities to demonstrate remorse. Instead, you portrayed yourself as wronged when evidence proves you were the one doing wrong. You planned exploitation. You facilitated elder abuse. You committed fraud. These are calculated choices. The court sentences you to 18 months for elder abuse, 24 months for fraud, served concurrently, with 3 years supervised probation. You will complete 100 hours community service at an elder care facility. You are permanently prohibited from contact with Alicia Moss or Sophia Winfrey. Should you violate this order, you face additional charges. You have failed to demonstrate understanding. Perhaps reflection will provide clarity." Richard's face went blank as the bailiff approached. He looked back at Alicia one final time with rage and disbelief, and she met his gaze with calm neutrality. She simply observed him as she would a stranger, because that's what he'd become outside. Reporters asked about forgiveness. Alicia paused, choosing words carefully. "Forgiveness isn't about him anymore. It's about me releasing the weight of his actions. He taught me lessons, though not the ones he intended. He taught me I can survive anything. He taught me my strength never depended on his validation. He taught me that love without respect is just abandonment with better marketing. I don't forgive him because forgiveness requires understanding you were wrong. He doesn't understand." His statement today proved that. "But I do release my anger because carrying it means he still occupies space in my life. He doesn't deserve that space anymore." Another reporter asked what was next. Alicia smiled genuinely. "Everything I want. That's what's next." The day unfolded like coming home to herself. Morning began in her kitchen where Sophia made breakfast while they laughed about a cooking show. They ate on the patio despite the cold, wrapped in blankets, watching birds at the feeders. She headed to work where her promotion meant leading her team and implementing protocols that would help other families. She mentored a young nurse, sharing wisdom about trusting your assessment even when others dismiss your concerns. She came home to find Jamaica waiting with takeout and movie plans. They curled up on the couch, talking about the advocacy organization's latest success. Dr. Harrison stopped by with garden flowers. Sister Geneva called about the church anniversary that evening. Alicia and Sophia decorated for Christmas, exactly 1 year since the return that changed everything. They hung lights and arranged her grandmother's nativity set. They played music and created new memories in spaces that used to hold pain. Sophia asked gently, "Do you regret any of it, the years with him?" Alicia considered honestly, "I regret the time lost. I regret not seeing truth sooner. But I don't regret the lessons. I became who I was meant to be by refusing to stay broken. He tried to make me small, and instead, I discovered I was bigger than anything he could contain. I learned what love isn't, which taught me what love is. Now I know the difference." 2 years later, Alicia had co-authored a nursing textbook chapter on elder abuse recognition. She'd purchased a rental property generating income. She was dating Trevor, a widowed history teacher who made her laugh and treated Sophia like family and respected her need to move slowly. She was cautious but open, trusting herself to recognize the difference between love and manipulation. Sophia's health had stabilized beautifully. She volunteered at Riverside, offering hope through her recovery story. She'd become a sought-after speaker at elder abuse prevention seminars. The final scene showed Alicia hosting a garden party. Church ladies shared recipes, hospital colleagues played cards. Advocacy volunteers admired the garden, children ran through the yard. Jamaica danced with Dr. Harrison. Trevor helped Sophia to a shaded chair. She stood watching her community, thinking about that December morning. She'd changed locks while terrified and broken. That brokenness had become her foundation for something stronger. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. "This is Jefferson Correctional Facility. Richard King is requesting to speak with you. Press 1 to accept." Alicia listened to the entire message. Then she hung up and blocked the number immediately. No hesitation, no second guessing. She returned to her party, to her life, to her power. Trevor noticed and asked if everything was okay. Alicia smiled. "Everything's perfect." Later that evening, after everyone left, Alicia and Sophia danced in the kitchen to soft music. Both women whole, both women free. They understood that the greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming so completely yourself that the person who tried to dim your light can't even recognize their own shadow anymore. And the greatest victory isn't their downfall, it's your rising.